So let's look at AAA, quite a short and interesting topic. We've been seeing AAA in many of the topics that we've looked at. But now this time we're really going to go deep into each component of AAA. So AAA defines a security architecture that is comprised of three functions referred to as authentication, authorization, and accounting. Each of these functions represent a modular component which can be applied as components of the security framework implemented by an enterprise. So a modular component, they are each complete on its own. They can work independently and often managed through the use of client-server-based protocols such as RADIUS and the Huawei Terminal Access Control Server. Now, implementation of the AAA architecture as a solution for enhanced functionality is introduced in order to reinforce the overall security framework of the enterprise network. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to Lynn.
Describe the schemes of the AA security architecture, successfully figure authentication and authorization schemes.
Exactly. So we're going to do it. Now, AAA enables, each of the A stands for one of these. So authentication, authorization, and accounting of users that are attempting to access destination network resources. Authentication is proving that you are who you're who you claim to be. Authentication. Most of the time done using a username and a password. Authorization determines what you can access. So after you've been authenticated, now what are you allowed to access? So for example, because I know you, you're my student, yes, you can come into my house, you can knock, I can identify you and let you in. But again, when you're in my house, you can only access maybe my bedroom and the washroom. My kitchen is a no-go zone, of course, and the other parts. So that is authorization. Then we have accounting. Accounting is me having a CCTV in my house that is watching you. So I can be able to have a record of what you accessed, for how long you accessed it, and how you actually used it. That is what we call accounting. Now, the first two, which is authentication and authorization, can actually be done on your router. Authentication and authorization can be done using your router. Now, whenever a router performs any of those two, the router is referred to as a network access server. Network access server, or simply as a NAS, network access server, or a NAS. The reason your router cannot perform accounting is because accounting, as you must have understood from my analogy, requires more storage space. Routers have limited storage space, and therefore most of the time accounting is done using an external server. An external server, commonly referred to as a AAA server. So the external server can do authentication, authorization, and accounting. But the router can only do authentication and authorization. Okay. Now, the other thing is that most of the times we create authentication or authorization or accounting schemes and we apply it to a group of users. That group of users is commonly referred to as a domain, so that the same scheme is applied to a particular group of people. So in a university network, for example, you can have the visitors domain, the students domain, the staff domain, maybe the non-teaching domain, the teaching domain, the management domain, and they all have different privileges on what they can access in your network. So we don't really apply authentication, authorization, and accounting on a one-by-one basis. We create groups to make it a little bit easier. Now let's begin with the very first AAA scheme, which is called authentication. As I said earlier, authentication is used to prove that you are who you claim to be, and most of the time it is done using a username, you providing a username and a password. Now, we have what we call three authentication schemes. The first one is called local authentication. Local authentication is when you're being authenticated by the network access server, or simply put, your router. Now, the other form of authentication is called remote authentication. When we talk about remote authentication, you are being authenticated by your AAA server. When you're authenticated with a AAA server, the AAA server can use one of two protocols. One of them is called RADIUS. RADIUS really stands for remote authentication. Remote authentication, dial-in user service protocol. So it's a protocol, user service protocol. Alternatively, so that's actually the open that's actually the open standard for remote authentication, the RADIUS. Now, Huawei have also created their own remote authentication protocol, excuse me, which is known as the Huawei Terminal Access Control System. Huawei Terminal Access Controller Access System. So you're either being authenticated using a server that is using either of those two protocols. Now, the last authentication scheme, which is not recommended, is referred to as non-authentication. Non-authentication. In non-authentication, the user does not need to provide a username or a password in order to access network resources. Of course, that is a big security risk. Now, the other thing that you must understand is that you can actually configure more than one authentication scheme. For example, you can configure local together with remote authentication scheme in your router. So when you configure more than one authentication scheme, these authentication modes are going to take effect in the sequence with which the configuration modes were configured. These one actually are, let's call them mods, authentication modes. So the one that you begin with is the one that is going to be the first one to be tried out. So if you begin configuring remote authentication before local authentication, then the user will be, first of all, authenticated by the remote server, then authenticated by the NAS. So whichever you configure first is the one that is going actually to be executed first. So that is all you need to know in the meantime about authentication schemes. And therefore, anytime you're configuring more than one, make sure that the very last one you configure maybe is non-authentication. Because if you configure non-authentication as the first one, people will be able to simply access network resources without being authenticated. So as I said here, the NAS, for example, simply uses a username and a password. So when you want to access server A, for example, then the authenticator will tell you, hey, identify yourself, please. Then you'll send a username and a password. So I'm host A, my password is Huawei123. My password is Huawei123. So that is how authentication works. And those are the 3 authentication modes. Now let's go on and look at authorization. So authorization determines the permission for users to gain access to specific network resources. Are they allowed to access it or not? Are they allowed to access it or not? So for example, here we have 2 servers, server A and server B. Server B can be accessed by anyone, but server A is actually a private server that maybe should be accessed with just a particular group of employees. So we need to configure authorization for people who we have already authenticated. Just like authentication, we actually have several modes of authorization. Modes of authorization. So the very first one being what we call non-authorization. Non-authorization, just as the name suggests, when you configure that, users are not authorized, so they can access anything, including everything. Then you have local authorization. In local authorization, users are authorized via the NAS, via the network access server, who is actually a router. Then we have what we call the if authenticated authorization mode. And the exam keeps asking questions around this particular mode, the if authenticated authorization mode. Now this particular mode is used where users are considered authorized in the event that the users are able to be authenticated in either the local or remote authentication mode. So you are considered authorized as long as you have already been authenticated with either local or remote authentication mode. Now, in particular, when you're using a RADIUS server, these 2 functionalities are actually tied. They are actually tied. So you cannot configure a RADIUS server to perform just authentication. It has to perform both the authentication and the authorization of the user when you're using a RADIUS server. Again, if multiple authorization modes are configured, then the authorization is performed in the sequence in which the configuration modes were configured, just like in the previous scheme that we looked at. And therefore, it is recommended that the non-authorization is configured as the last, so that if the remote server is down, then you're not going to have remote authorization. If the local server is down, then you're not going to have maybe local authentication or authorization like that. So you need to configure the non-authorization mode as the last one. So those are actually the three modes that we have. So non, local, then let me just use here remote. We actually have remote authorization when you're using, of course, a server. Remote authorization, and we also have the if authenticated authorization mode. So this can be the last one. Okay, so here you can see we actually create groups for different people, and we can be able to tell the group that they are in, the user group. So we have the device group and the user group, and when they can be able to access it. So these are some of the things that we can configure, some of the parameters we can configure when we are configuring authorization. The time they can access. So you don't want staff members to be able to access some of your network resources at night. So you configure the working hours. Then you also configure their privilege. We understand these different user levels all the way from 1 to 15, which determines what they can do once they access it. Then lastly, we have accounting. Accounting is the only scheme within the AAA scheme that cannot be performed in your router because of the limited storage capacity of routers. So really, you must use either a RADIUS server or a Huawei terminal access controller server if you want to do accounting. Accounting is used to monitor the activity and the usage of authorized users who have gained access to the network resources. Some of the parameters that are monitored, this is not all, just some. For example, we want to know when you came in, so the login time, your username, so that we can pin you down. For how long did you access this resource? Then how much bandwidth did you consume on this particular resource? Now, we only have two modes, two accounting modes. So the very first one, of course, is non-accounting. Non-accounting is when users are not being monitored. And the next one is remote accounting, when we're using a RADIUS or a Huawei terminal access controller, access control server. So let's now talk about domains. Domains are used to create different groups so that we can apply the AAA schemes to a group rather than to individuals. So that is what domains are actually used for. Now, generally, A domain is usually created using one of these character suffixes. So you can either use an @ or a pipe symbol or a percentage, like that. So for example, you can create a domain like admin, a domain like finance, a domain like student, like that. So that is how we create domains. Now generally, we have in a you can actually in the routers you can create a maximum of 32 domains. Actually no, in total there are 32 domains. So let me just total, we have 32 domains, but you can only be able to create a maximum of 30 domains. So where are these 2 domains? So we have 2 default domains. The first default domain is simply known as the default domain. What is the purpose of the default domain? When users log in without using any domain, so without using the @ symbol, for example, Caris @finance. So I simply log in using my username without associating it with a particular domain, then I'll automatically be thrown into the default domain. Then the other one is known as the default _admin domain. So this one is used for administrators, for network administrators. So how do we know that this one is a network administrators? When you're trying to access network resources using some protocols such as Telnet, Secure Shell, SSH, FTP, and other terminals, we actually throw you into the default admin domain if you've not used any domain to log in. Otherwise, if you're just trying to access the network resources as a normal user, we send you to the default domain. So it is on this domain that we apply a certain AAA scheme and not on individual people. So for example, in this particular network, we have 2 domains, the partner @partner and @Huawei. So depending on who you are, there is only much that you can access on the Huawei servers. So for example, for me, I'm a partner, so I can download PowerPoint notes from server A. So those are some of the things that actually are implemented on the network. Otherwise, you as a student, even though you have a Huawei account, you might not be able to download to access that server and maybe download notes from that server because they expect your instructor to give it to you. So you're not authorized to actually be able to do downloads. So that's just an example. So let's see, how do we configure AAA? This is something that we've done severally. So for example, here we are in this router RTA. So we go ahead and type AAA under system view. Then we create a user. So local user, the username here is Huawei. Then password cipher. Then the password we are using is hello123. After that, we specify an authentication. We create an authentication scheme using the command authentication scheme auth1. Then after that, it will get us into that auth1 view. Then we specify the authentication mode. So we want to use local authentication. Then we quit. Then we go ahead and create an authorization scheme. So this is authorization. The first one was authentication. We call it Auth2. Then again, inside Auth2, we specify the authorization mode. So we want to do local authorization. After we are done with that, we can now create a domain. So this is how we create a domain. So domain space, then the name of the domain. Then the name of the domain. So after you're done with that, you can be able to specify the authentication and the authorization schemes that you just created above. So we want it to use for all people that are under the Huawei domain. We want it to apply the authentication scheme Auth1 and the authorization scheme Auth2. So we can always reveal the details of a particular domain by using the display domain name, domain space name space, then the name of the domain. So we can get the details, like the name of this domain is Huawei, the state is active, the authentication scheme name is Auth1, the authorization scheme name is Auth2. And as you can see here, the accounting scheme name is the default, and the default is actually no accounting, none accounting, because we've not specified either a RADIUS or a Huawei terminal access controller, access control server. We've not specified them. So the default accounting scheme is actually non-accounting. Okay, so that is it, ladies and gentlemen, about AAA. A volunteer, please, to take up the first question and another one to take up the next one. Anyone? Benson, are you there? Kenneth?
Yes, I'm here.
Kichinda, you've been conspicuously silent today. Mr. Kichinda. Benson, take up the first one.
I can answer that.
Okay, go ahead, Lynn.
Which two AA schemes are supported when configuring VRP? It's the authentication and the authorization. Yes, the accounting one will require the Huawei server, the RADIUS one.
Okay, thank you. Either the RADIUS that uses either of the protocol, eh? Thank you so much, Lynn. Who's taking the next one? Nick, Chris, or Joshua, you go ahead.
Okay, if domain is defined for users, what action is
defined as?
The user is given a default domain.
Exactly. So the user is put into the default domain. Thank you very much. What if the user is a network admin and they're accessing the network resource using Telnet? Which domain are they going to be added to?
Default underscore domain admin.
Exactly, default underscore admin. Asanteni sana. Thank you very much.